Richard Thompson stood on the doorstep, staring at the suitcase in his hands, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. His fingers gripped the handle tightly, but it felt like it was slipping from his grasp, as if everything he had known, everything he had built over the years, was slipping away too. He looked up at the house that had once been a sanctuary, a place of comfort, and now it was just another memory of what he had lost. It was a two-story, red-bricked house, nestled at the end of a quiet street where children once played and neighbors once shared laughter over cups of tea. The paint was beginning to peel, and the garden, once meticulously tended to by Richard himself, was overgrown with weeds. But the house still held memories, vivid and clear in his mind. He had spent decades here, raising his family, nurturing his son, Mark, and watching his own life unfold. This had been his home, a place where he thought he'd grow old with his loved ones by his side. But now? Now it felt like a prison. Richard couldn't bring himself to look back at the house. He'd already done so once, only to see the curtains twitch, the faint silhouette of his son standing behind the window, watching him with an expression that could have been pity, but Richard couldn't be sure. Mark had changed so much over the years. The boy he had raised, the young man he had tried to guide, seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone unrecognizable. It hadn't always been like this. Richard remembered the early days, when Mark was a child, full of laughter and energy. Those memories seemed like another lifetime now, like a different reality. They had been a family then. But as Mark had grown older, something shifted. Richard couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when it all started to fall apart, but he knew it had. Little things at first, snide remarks, distant behavior, avoiding family gatherings, keeping secrets. And then it escalated. The last few months had been the hardest. Richard had been sick, his body betraying him as age took its toll. It wasn't easy to admit, but he had begun relying on Mark for help more often. A simple thing like picking up groceries or mowing the lawn had become a struggle for him. At first, Mark had seemed sympathetic, if not a little distant. But lately, there had been more tension, more arguments, more cold silences. Richard had tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just a phase, that things would go back to normal. But deep down, he knew. This wasn't a phase. This was the beginning of the end. The day Mark told him to leave was the day Richard realized just how deep the rift between them had grown. It hadn't been an argument. It hadn't been a dramatic confrontation. It had been quiet, almost casual, as if it was something that had been decided long ago. Mark had come to him while he was sitting in his favorite chair, the one by the window where the sun would warm his back in the afternoon. "Dad," Mark had said, his voice flat, emotionless. "I can't do this anymore. You're a burden. I can't keep taking care of you." Richard had blinked, unsure if he had heard him correctly. "What do you mean, a burden?" "I mean exactly that," Mark had replied, his words slicing through the air like a blade. "You've gotten old. You can't even take care of yourself. I can't deal with it. I'm done." Richard had stood up, but his legs had felt weak. His mind was racing, struggling to process the words that had just shattered him. "Mark, this is my home. My house. I built this for you. For us." Mark had just shrugged, as if the history of their family meant nothing. "Not anymore, Dad. You need to find somewhere else to live." Richard had tried to argue, to reason with him, but it had been pointless. Mark's mind was made up. The door had been opened, and Richard had been shoved out, not physically, but emotionally. The house that he had called home for so many years was no longer his. His son had cast him aside, as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had always imagined his old age would be filled with family, his son, his daughter-in-law, and maybe even grandchildren one day, gathered around him, taking care of him just as he had taken care of them. But it was clear now that those dreams were nothing more than illusions. Richard didn't know where to go. His friends were few, and his family had long since moved away. He couldn't impose on them, not when he had just been discarded by his own flesh and blood. So, with nothing left but his suitcase, he had stepped out the door and into the unknown. As he stood outside, the wind biting at his face, something caught his eye. It was just a glimpse at first, something buried under the massive oak tree in the backyard, a flash of white paper. At first, he thought it was just trash that had blown in from somewhere. But then, as if drawn by some invisible force, Richard found himself walking toward the tree. His heart pounded in his chest, a strange sense of urgency driving him forward. The tree had stood in their yard for as long as he could remember. Richard had spent many afternoons beneath its thick branches, watching his son play, reading a book, or simply reflecting on the years that had passed. Now, it seemed like the only thing that remained, standing silent and steadfast amid the chaos of his life. He knelt down and began to dig around the base of the tree. His hands, old and stiff, worked quickly, pushing aside the dirt and debris until he finally uncovered the object that had caught his attention. It was a letter. Faded with age, the envelope was yellowed and brittle, as if it had been there for years, hidden away and forgotten. Richard's heart skipped a beat. He turned it over in his hands. The name on the front was his own, Richard Thompson. But the handwriting, it wasn't his. It was unfamiliar, elegant, and looping in a way that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. His fingers shook as he slid the envelope open, and the crinkling sound echoed in the stillness of the yard. The paper inside was delicate, almost fragile, and he unfolded it with great care. The message was short, written in a careful, almost cryptic hand. "There's something you don't remember, but you need to. The truth will set you free, Richard. But be careful, someone doesn't want you to find it." Richard's breath caught in his throat. Who had written this? What truth? And why hadn't he remembered it? 1,000 questions flooded his mind, but one stood out above all the others: who didn't want him to find the truth? He stood there, staring at the letter, a cold shiver running down his spine. It felt as if the earth beneath his feet had shifted. He was no longer just a man thrown out by his son. He was someone on the brink of discovering something far bigger, far darker, than he could have ever imagined. Richard knew one thing for sure: his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The betrayal of his son had opened the door, but this letter, this mysterious message, was pushing him down a path he had never expected to walk. He didn't know where it would lead, but he had no choice. He had to find out the truth. He looked back at the house one last time. Mark was still inside, no doubt still oblivious to what was unfolding. But Richard wasn't going to let this go. Not now. He stuffed the letter into his jacket pocket, determined to uncover whatever secrets it held. And with that, he turned away from the house, leaving behind the remnants of his old life and stepping into an uncertain future. Richard walked away from the house, his heart heavy with confusion, betrayal, and the strange sense of urgency that gripped him. He didn't know what he was searching for, but the words in that mysterious letter had set something in motion inside him. He felt a deep, inexplicable pull toward the unknown, like there was something he had forgotten, something buried in the recesses of his mind, waiting to be uncovered. The streets were quiet as he walked. It was early evening, and the dimming light cast long shadows on the ground. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that promised an early frost in the days to come. Richard didn't have a destination. All he had was the letter and an overwhelming need to understand its cryptic message. But the more he thought about it, the more questions piled up in his mind. Who had written the letter? The handwriting was unfamiliar, but it felt like he should know it. There was something about it that tugged at the corners of his memory, something that almost made him feel as though he had seen it before. But where? And why had the message been hidden in the backyard, under the oak tree? Was it meant for him, or was someone trying to send a warning? He tried to push the questions aside, but they wouldn't go away. The truth that the letter promised to reveal felt elusive, like a shadow just out of reach. Every step Richard took felt like it was leading him further into the unknown. His feet carried him down the street, through familiar neighborhoods he had passed 1,000 times before. The houses, with their neatly trimmed lawns and bright lights shining from windows, looked almost foreign to him now. The world around him felt like it had shifted, like it was no longer the place he had once known. He turned down a side street, one that led to the local park. Richard wasn't sure why he was headed there. It wasn't as if the park held any particular significance. But there was something calming about the idea of being surrounded by nature, of sitting on a bench under the trees and allowing his mind to quiet for a moment. He needed time to think, to make sense of the letter and everything that had happened. As he entered the park, he noticed the benches, still empty at this hour, and the small walking paths that wound through the trees. The park was one of the few places where he could always find peace, away from the constant noise and bustle of life. He approached one of the benches and sat down, the old wood creaking under his weight. He took the letter from his pocket again, carefully unfolded it, and read it once more. The words seemed to echo in his mind. "There's something you don't remember, but you need to. The truth will set you free, Richard. But be careful, someone doesn't want you to find it." Who was trying to stop him? And what truth was he supposed to uncover? Richard closed his eyes, letting the cool breeze brush against his face. As he sat there, a memory began to surface, faint at first, then growing clearer with each passing moment. It was a memory from when he was a young man, just starting out in life. He remembered a conversation, a heated argument with his father. His father had been a stern man, old-fashioned in many ways, and had never been particularly affectionate. Richard had grown up with the feeling that his father had high expectations of him, and that nothing he did was ever quite good enough. But there had been one moment, a single, pivotal conversation, that Richard could never forget. He was in his 20s at the time, freshly married to his wife, Margaret. They had just bought their first house, and Richard had been full of pride and excitement. But his father, always the critic, had not shared in his joy. Instead, he had warned him about the dangers of trusting too easily, of letting people into your life who might take advantage of you. "You never know who you can trust, Richard," his father had said, his voice gravelly with age. "People will betray you when you least expect it. And when that happens, it'll be too late to turn back." At the time, Richard had brushed off the warning, thinking it was just his father's cynical view of the world. But now, as he sat in the park, he couldn't help but wonder if his father had known something about betrayal, something that Richard hadn't understood then. The memory faded as quickly as it had come, but Richard was left with a lingering sense of unease. His father had never been a man to give advice lightly, and that warning had stuck with him for years. But had it been more than just a father's concern? Was there something he hadn't told him? Something important that he had kept hidden? Richard stood up from the bench, the cool air still swirling around him, and began walking again, the letter clutched tightly in his hand. He had to get to the bottom of this. There was no turning back now. As Richard walked, the sense of urgency began to grow. The more he thought about the letter, the more it felt like it was part of something bigger, something connected to his past in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. He needed to find answers, and he knew where he had to start. He needed to visit his father's old house. Richard's father had passed away several years ago, and the house had been sold soon after the funeral. But Richard remembered it well, every corner, every room. He had spent countless hours there as a child, and it was where he had shared that final conversation with his father before he passed. The house was on the outskirts of town, a little ways from the park. Richard had never gone back since the funeral, but now it felt like the only place he could go to search for the answers he needed. There was a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach that told him the answers were there, hidden somewhere in the walls of that house. When he arrived, the house looked as though it had been abandoned. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the windows were dark, their once clean glass now streaked with dust and grime. The place had fallen into disrepair since the sale, and it seemed as though no one had taken care of it in years. The house looked haunted, as if the ghosts of the past still lingered there, waiting to be uncovered. Richard hesitated for a moment, standing in front of the gate. He had never imagined he would return to this place, especially under such circumstances. But something inside him pushed him forward, and before he could think twice, he opened the gate and walked up the overgrown path to the front door. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the hinges protesting against the weight of time. The inside was just as he remembered, dark, musty, and filled with the scent of old wood and memories. Dust motes floated in the air, and the furniture, though covered in sheets, still held the shape of the rooms he had grown up in. He wandered through the house, each room triggering a flood of memories. He passed by the old fireplace where his father had often sat, staring into the flames as if lost in thought. He walked past the kitchen, where his mother had spent hours preparing meals for the family, and into the hallway that led to his father's study. Richard stopped in front of the study door. This room, more than any other, had always felt like a sanctuary to his father. It had been the one place where his father seemed to let his guard down, where he could be alone with his thoughts. Richard had never been allowed inside as a child, but he had always been drawn to it, fascinated by the idea of what his father kept hidden behind that closed door. Now, standing before it as an adult, Richard's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. He turned it slowly and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as he remembered it. Old leather-bound books lined the shelves, and a large mahogany desk sat in the center of the room. But there was something new, something out of place. On the desk, partially hidden behind a stack of papers, was a small, locked box. Richard's heart skipped a beat. The box was familiar. He had seen it before, long ago. It was the same box his father had kept locked for as long as Richard could remember. His father had never spoken of it, and Richard had always wondered what secrets it held. With trembling hands, Richard reached for the box, his mind racing with questions. Was this the truth his father had hidden from him? Was this what the letter had been referring to? He fumbled with the lock, his heart pounding in his chest, until finally, it gave way with a click. Inside the box, there were several items, old photographs, letters, and a few other objects that Richard couldn't immediately identify. But at the bottom of the box was something else, something that caught his eye immediately, a small, yellowed envelope with his name written on it in the same handwriting as the letter he had found in the backyard. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he picked up the envelope, his mind reeling. He knew, without a doubt, that this was it, the truth he had been searching for. With shaking hands, he opened the envelope, and the words inside sent a shockwave through him. Richard, you don't remember me, but I am the key to everything. The truth about your past, about your father, and about the betrayal that has been hidden for so long. It's time you knew the truth. The truth. What was his father hiding? What had he been kept in the dark about for all these years? Richard's mind raced. The letter was the first step, but the journey to uncover the full story was just beginning. Richard stood in his father's study, the world around him fading into silence as he clutched the envelope in his trembling hands. The letter inside it seemed almost to burn with significance, as though it was more than just ink on paper. It was a key to something much larger, something that could change everything he thought he knew about his past. He opened the letter, holding his breath as he carefully unfolded the yellowed paper. The handwriting, though delicate and elegant, seemed to strike a familiar chord in his memory. There was something about it that made Richard's heart race, though he couldn't place why. It was as if he had seen it before, perhaps long ago, perhaps something he had forgotten. The letter began with words that sent a chill down his spine. Richard, you don't remember me, but I am the key to everything. The truth about your past, about your father, and about the betrayal that has been hidden for so long. It's time you knew the truth. Richard's hands shook as he read the first sentence again, his mind racing. Who was this person? His father had never mentioned anyone like this. No one in the family had ever spoken of secrets or betrayals. Everything had always seemed so normal. Yet this letter suggested otherwise. The words hinted at things that were buried deep, things that no one, least of all Richard, had ever considered. He sat down in the old, creaky chair behind his father's desk. His father's study, so full of memories, now felt like a strange, foreboding place. Every corner, every object in the room seemed to carry some hidden meaning, some clue that he hadn't understood until now. The box on the desk, locked away for so many years, seemed to beckon to him, its contents now seeming even more crucial than ever. He turned his attention back to the letter, reading the next paragraph. You were only a child when everything changed. You wouldn't remember it, but there was a decision made, one that your father and I were both part of. A decision that would alter the course of your life. I don't expect you to understand yet, but I will make you remember. The time has come for you to learn the truth, Richard. The betrayal that has haunted us all for so long is finally ready to be revealed. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. A decision made? A betrayal? These were things he had never heard about. His father had always been distant, even cold at times, but betrayal? Was it possible? Had his father been involved in something so dark? And if so, why hadn't Richard ever known? Why had no one ever told him the truth? Suddenly, a wave of unease washed over him. His father, who had always been so careful with words, so meticulous in his actions, had kept secrets from Richard. But this was more than just about his father. This letter was telling him that he, too, had been kept in the dark about something that was far greater than any family dispute or disagreement. Richard clenched his fists, his mind racing. He needed answers. He needed to know what had happened, what had been hidden from him. He had to understand why his father had kept this secret, and why it had been passed down to him, in some strange way. The letter continued. You must come to me, Richard. I know you're looking for the truth, and I will give it to you. But you must come alone. No one else can know what you are about to discover. There are forces at play, forces that would stop you from learning the truth. They've been working against us for years. But it is time. I will show you everything you need to know. The truth will set you free. Richard's mind was spinning. The letter didn't explain much, but it raised far more questions than it answered. Who was this person? Why did they claim to be the key to everything? And why was he being told to come alone? The words, forces at play, haunted him. Who were these forces? And why had his father kept such a powerful secret from him? Richard couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he was about to uncover was far bigger than he could have imagined. His father's study, the locked box, the hidden letter, it was all part of something far more complex, something tangled in shadows and betrayal. Richard folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. His heart was racing. The letter had mentioned a place. It had implied that there was a meeting, somewhere he needed to go in order to learn the truth. But where? And who was behind this? He could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on him, and he knew there was no turning back now. Richard didn't waste any time. He grabbed his jacket and left the study, walking out of the house into the cool night air. He didn't know where to go, but the letter had made it clear, he needed to find answers, and he needed to do it alone. He couldn't involve anyone else, not even his son Mark. Mark, who had already betrayed him once, who had shown him no loyalty, no empathy. Richard wasn't sure he could trust him again, not with this. He walked aimlessly through the streets, his mind consumed by the letter's contents. He thought about his father, the man who had always been so private, so controlled. He thought about the strained relationship they had had in the years before his father's death. Had his father known something he hadn't shared? Had there been secrets that Richard wasn't meant to uncover? It seemed so impossible, yet everything about the letter felt real, like it was speaking directly to him. And then, as if by fate, Richard's feet led him toward the old town square, a place that had once been central to everything in his life. The square had always been a gathering place, where families and friends met, and where Richard himself had spent countless hours as a boy, running errands for his mother, or meeting his friends after school. He stopped in the middle of the square and looked around, the old, familiar buildings casting long shadows under the dim streetlights. The place was quiet now, with only a few scattered people moving about, but Richard felt a pull, a sensation that this was where he was supposed to be. His eyes scanned the area, as though searching for something he couldn't quite name. And then he saw it. Across the square, at the far end, was a small, inconspicuous building that he hadn't noticed in years. It was an old storefront, its windows dark and dusty, its door ajar. The building seemed out of place, almost as if it had been forgotten by time itself. But there was something about it that called to him. Richard hesitated for a moment. Was this it? Was this the place mentioned in the letter? There were no signs, no indication of what the building was or who might be inside. But Richard couldn't ignore the feeling that something awaited him there, something he needed to confront. He walked toward the building, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty square. As he approached the door, his hand instinctively reached out, and he pushed it open. The door creaked as it swung inward, and Richard stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single hanging bulb above. The room was sparse, empty shelves lined the walls, and dust filled the air, making it feel like the place had been abandoned for years. But in the center of the room, there was a desk, and behind it sat a figure, a man, tall and thin, with piercing eyes that seemed to see right through Richard. Richard froze, his heart skipping a beat. The man's presence was unsettling, as if he had been waiting for Richard all along. He didn't speak immediately, but his eyes followed Richard's every movement, as though expecting him. "You've come," the man said, his voice low and calm. Richard couldn't bring himself to answer right away. His mind was racing, his thoughts tangled in a web of confusion and fear. Who was this man? Was he the one who had written the letter? And if so, why had he called Richard here? "Yes," Richard managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here." The man cut him off with a raised hand. "You've done well to come alone. I was beginning to wonder if you would." He stood up from the desk, his long, lean frame casting an eerie shadow in the dim light. "Sit," the man gestured to a chair across from him. Richard sat down cautiously, still unsure of what was happening. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, questions without answers, fears without names. But one thing was certain. He was in the presence of someone who knew the truth, someone who could give him the answers he had been searching for. The man smiled, a cold, unsettling smile. "I suppose you have many questions, Richard. But we have little time, and there is much to explain. You've stumbled into something far bigger than you realize. And the truth, well, the truth is not something that everyone can handle." Richard's breath caught in his throat. "The truth," he repeated, trying to steady his nerves. "Tell me. What is it? What have I been kept in the dark about all these years?" The man leaned forward, his gaze never leaving Richard's. "The truth is this, everything you thought you knew about your father, your family, it's all a lie. The betrayal wasn't just between your father and me, it was between us all. And now, it's time for you to take your place in the story." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. The words echoed in his ears as the world seemed to spin around him. The betrayal? His father had been involved in something terrible, something that had affected not just Richard but everyone around him. But what was it? What had happened that had remained hidden for so long? "I will show you," the man said, his voice soft yet filled with an undeniable intensity. "But first, you must decide whether you are ready to face the truth. Are you ready, Richard?" The question hung in the air, heavy and full of significance. Richard knew that this was it, this was the moment when everything would change. He had to make a choice. And in that moment, he knew the answer. Yes, he said, his voice firm. I'm ready. The man nodded. Very well. Let's begin. Richard's heart hammered in his chest as the man across from him gave a slight nod, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on him with an unsettling intensity. The room seemed to close in, the air thick with the weight of the unknown. The moment he had been dreading, and yet anticipating, had finally arrived. The truth, which had eluded him for so long, was within his grasp, and now he had to decide if he was ready to face it. Yes, I'm ready, Richard repeated, his voice steady, but his hands, hidden beneath the table, clenched into fists. His entire life had been built on lies, on the foundation of his father's silence. And now, here he was, sitting in this dimly lit room, staring into the eyes of a man who promised to reveal everything that had been kept hidden for decades. The man's lips curled into a slight smile, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Very well, he said. But once you know the truth, there's no going back. You will understand your father's actions, but you may never look at your family the same way again. Are you certain? Richard hesitated for a brief moment, the enormity of the situation settling in. His mind flashed to his father, to the memories of a man who had always been so distant, so unemotional. He had always assumed that the silence between them was simply a result of their personalities. But now, he wasn't so sure. What if his father had been keeping something more than just secrets? What if there was a far darker reason for his behavior? I'm certain, Richard said, his voice resolute. I need to know. The man leaned back in his chair, the creaking sound of the old wood filling the otherwise silent room. He seemed to consider Richard for a moment, as though weighing his resolve before speaking again. All right, Richard, the man said. Listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you will change everything. It's about your father, and it's about what he did. What he was a part of. You see, your father was not just a stern, cold man. He was part of something far larger, an organization, a group that existed in the shadows, manipulating events for decades. Richard's mind raced. An organization? Manipulating events? It sounded like something out of a thriller, but the man's tone was serious, his expression grim. He wasn't joking. Richard could sense that. Your father was a key member of this group, the man continued, but the involvement wasn't something he chose. It was thrust upon him, by me. Richard's brow furrowed, confusion swirling in his chest. You? He asked, his voice shaky with disbelief. You're telling me that you... The man raised a hand, silencing him gently. Yes. I am the one who brought your father into this world of secrecy. It's not something he wanted, but it was a path that led him down a very dangerous road. And it's the same road you are now on, Richard. Richard blinked, processing the words. He had heard stories, of course. Stories about secret societies, shadowy organizations controlling events from behind the scenes. But he had always dismissed them as nothing more than myths, conspiracy theories, stories meant to entertain or frighten. Never once had he imagined that his own father could have been involved in something so dark. What kind of organization? Richard asked, his voice cracking slightly as he fought to maintain composure. The man didn't immediately answer, instead walking over to a shelf against the wall and retrieving an old, weathered book. He placed it on the table in front of Richard with a thud. The book's cover was faded and torn, but Richard could make out the title, The Brotherhood of Shadows. This, the man said, is the organization your father was a part of. The Brotherhood of Shadows. It is an ancient group, founded centuries ago, with the goal of influencing world events, guiding them in ways that benefit only a select few. It operates in secrecy, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And your father was a critical part of it. Richard's mind reeled as he reached for the book, his fingers trembling. The Brotherhood of Shadows. The name sent a shiver down his spine, as though just uttering it out loud carried a certain weight, a certain danger. He opened the book cautiously, the pages yellowed with age. The text was dense, filled with references to ancient rituals, covert operations, and the intricate web of influence the group had woven throughout history. He skimmed the pages, catching glimpses of the organization's goals. What stood out most was the recurring theme of control over governments, control over markets, control over individuals. The Brotherhood wasn't just an organization, it was an intricate, powerful network of influence that spanned generations. But there was something else hidden in the pages, something that chilled Richard to the bone. In the margins of several pages were handwritten notes in his father's unmistakable handwriting. The same handwriting he had seen in the letter he had discovered in the backyard. This is my father's handwriting," Richard muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The man nodded. "Yes. Your father was deeply involved. But he wasn't the only one. There were others, people who worked with him, people you knew. People you trusted." Richard's pulse quickened. "Who?" he demanded. "Who else was involved?" The man's eyes darkened, and he leaned forward, speaking with quiet intensity. "Your mother." Richard recoiled, stunned by the revelation. His mother? No, it couldn't be. He had always thought of her as a gentle, loving woman, someone who had stayed out of the drama and conflict that had surrounded his father. But now, the pieces were falling into place in ways he hadn't anticipated. "Your mother," the man repeated, "was one of the key members of the Brotherhood. She and your father were partners in this operation. Together, they made decisions that affected the lives of thousands, decisions that were cloaked in secrecy, decisions that changed the course of history." Richard felt a sharp pain in his chest as the weight of the truth settled upon him. His father, the stern, cold man he had always resented, had been hiding a dark secret for all these years. And so had his mother. "Why didn't I know about this?" Richard asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "Why did they keep this from me?" The man leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "Because, Richard, your parents wanted to protect you. They wanted to keep you safe from the world they had become a part of. But they didn't realize that their secrets would eventually be passed down to you. The Brotherhood doesn't let go so easily. Once you're in for life." Richard's mind reeled. "So, what now? What does this all mean for me? What do you want from me?" The man stood up, his shadow stretching long across the room as he paced slowly. "I want you to take your father's place." Richard's heart dropped at the words. "What? Take his place?" "Yes," the man said, turning to face Richard. "Your father made a decision years ago, a decision that set everything in motion. But it's your turn now, Richard. The Brotherhood has been watching you, waiting for you to come to this moment. You are the heir to their legacy." Richard stood up, feeling as though the ground beneath him had been ripped away. "No. I can't be a part of this. I can't be involved in something like this. I won't." The man's eyes flashed with a cold gleam. "You don't have a choice, Richard. The Brotherhood doesn't give you options. It's time for you to decide if you want to embrace your birthright, or if you want to continue living in ignorance. The truth is already here. You've learned it. Now, you must decide what you're going to do with it." Richard was paralyzed by the weight of the decision in front of him. The choice seemed impossible. On one hand, he could walk away, reject everything he had just learned, and return to the life he had once known. But on the other hand, he realized, if he walked away, he might never fully understand the depths of his father's involvement in this secret world. He might never understand the consequences of the decisions that had been made, and the part he was meant to play in it all. "I need time to think," Richard said, his voice tight with uncertainty. "This is too much." The man nodded. "Of course. You have all the time in the world. But remember, there are forces at play, Richard. They've been waiting for you to make a decision. Choose wisely. Richard turned and walked out of the building, his head spinning. The world he had known no longer made sense. Everything he thought he understood about his life, his family, and his father had been turned upside down. He wasn't sure where to go from here, or what he was supposed to do with this newfound knowledge. But one thing was certain, he could never go back to the way things were before. The path ahead was uncertain, but Richard knew one thing: the truth was out there, and he would have to face it, whether he was ready or not. Richard walked out of the building, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The weight of the truth that had been revealed to him seemed to press down on his chest, suffocating him, making it hard to breathe. His father, the man he had spent his entire life trying to understand, had been involved in something so dark, so hidden, that even Richard's most vivid imaginations could not have prepared him for it. The Brotherhood of Shadows. His mother's involvement. The cold, calculating web of influence that had entangled his family for generations. It all felt like a nightmare, and Richard was trapped in the center of it. As he stepped back into the cool night air, the darkness around him seemed to mirror the turmoil inside him. He was lost, caught between the life he had always known and the grim reality that now lay before him. He had come here seeking answers, but what he had discovered felt more like a curse than a revelation. It was as if the truth had opened a door that Richard was not sure he was ready to walk through. Yet, deep down, he knew that there was no turning back now. The man had given him a choice, to take his father's place or to walk away from it all. But how could Richard possibly make that decision? He had spent his entire life trying to escape the shadows of his father's distant, cold presence, but now it seemed that those very shadows were coming to claim him. What would he be signing up for if he agreed to join the Brotherhood? And if he refused, what would happen to him? To his family? He wasn't sure he could live with the weight of those questions. Richard's footsteps echoed in the empty streets as he made his way back to the house. The town was eerily quiet at this hour, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the buildings. He couldn't help but feel like he was walking through a dream, a strange and twisted dream where nothing was as it seemed, where the lines between right and wrong had been blurred beyond recognition. As he reached his doorstep, Richard stopped, his hand resting on the door handle. He thought about his son, Mark, who had been the one to push him into investigating his father's past in the first place. Mark had always been curious, always probing into the things Richard had tried to keep hidden. But how could Richard explain any of this to him? How could he tell Mark that his grandfather had been a key player in a secret organization that had manipulated the course of history? That his family had been entangled in something so far-reaching, so dangerous, that even the smallest mistake could have deadly consequences? Richard took a deep breath, steadying himself before he opened the door. The house was quiet, but there was an unsettling tension in the air. As if the walls themselves knew that something had changed. He walked into the living room, where Mark was sitting on the couch, eyes glued to the television. The moment Richard entered, Mark turned his head, his expression unreadable. "How did it go?" Mark asked, his voice calm, but there was a note of curiosity in it, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Richard stood still, his hands by his sides. He didn't know where to begin. He had so many questions swirling in his mind, but the one thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't lie to Mark. Not anymore. "Mark," Richard said, his voice quieter than usual, "I've learned some things that I didn't expect. Things that change everything." Mark didn't respond immediately, his eyes studying Richard carefully, as though waiting for more. Richard took a deep breath and continued. "I've learned about your grandfather," Richard began, his throat tight as the words escaped. "He was involved in something dark. An organization called the Brotherhood of Shadows. A group that has been manipulating world events for generations. Your mother was involved too. They kept it hidden from me, from all of us. But now I know the truth." Mark's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't speak. Richard could feel the weight of the silence in the room, a silence that was heavier than any words could convey. "I don't know what to make of it," Richard continued, his voice shaking slightly. I don't know if I should accept it, or if I should walk away from it all. The man I spoke to said I have a choice. To take your grandfather's place, or to turn away from it. But I don't know if I'm strong enough to make that decision. I don't know what it means, what it would cost. And I don't know if I can live with the consequences. Mark stood up slowly, his expression now serious. And what do you want to do, Dad? Richard was taken aback by the question. What do you mean? I mean, what do you want? Mark asked again, his voice more forceful now. This isn't just about your father or your mother anymore. It's about you. It's your choice. Do you want to take this on, or do you want to walk away from it? But don't expect the world to just let you forget what you've learned. You can't unknow this, can you? Richard looked at Mark, the boy he had raised, and realized how much he had grown in the last few years. Mark was no longer a child who needed his father to hold his hand through every decision. He was a young man with his own ideas, his own dreams, and his own understanding of the world. And now, Richard saw that Mark was trying to push him toward a decision, one that was his to make. I don't know, Richard admitted, his voice breaking. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I never wanted any of this, Mark. I just wanted to be your father. But now, it feels like everything has changed. Mark nodded, his face serious. I get it. I really do. But you're not alone in this, okay? You don't have to carry this burden by yourself. If you need me, I'm here. But you have to decide. And you can't keep running from it. If this is who we are, then we have to face it. Head on. Richard felt a surge of emotion at his son's words. They weren't just words of encouragement, they were words of truth. Mark was right. Richard couldn't keep running from his family's past. He had to make a choice. He had to confront the darkness that had been hidden for so long. The next few days were a blur. Richard spent hours poring over the book, The Brotherhood of Shadows, trying to make sense of the cryptic information contained within its pages. It was filled with references to people he had never heard of, places that seemed impossibly far from his small, quiet town, and events that spanned centuries. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the sense that this wasn't just history. It was a living, breathing entity that was still operating in the shadows, still pulling the strings. He returned to the building where he had met the man, the one who had spoken to him about his father's involvement in the Brotherhood. He didn't know why he was going back. Maybe it was to seek more answers, or maybe it was because, deep down, he knew that he couldn't make this decision on his own. He needed to know what the Brotherhood wanted from him, what the consequences of his choice would be. When he arrived, the door to the building was once again ajar. He stepped inside, and the man was waiting for him, standing near the desk as if he had known Richard would return. You've come back, the man said, his voice cool, but not without a hint of something else, something like anticipation. I need to know more, Richard said, his voice steady but firm. I need to understand what this means. What would it mean for me if I join? And what would happen if I refuse? The man nodded slowly. That's the question, isn't it? The answer isn't simple. Joining the Brotherhood is not about power or wealth. It's about responsibility. Once you accept, you are bound by an oath, a code of conduct that is unbreakable. You will work behind the scenes, shaping the future in ways that others will never know. You will be part of something much larger than yourself. You will be part of the Brotherhood. Richard felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The thought of being a puppet in someone else's game, of wielding influence without ever being seen, felt both intoxicating and terrifying. And if I refuse? Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man's eyes darkened. If you refuse, Richard, you will live with the knowledge of what you could have been. You will always be haunted by the truth. And the Brotherhood does not forget those who turn their backs on it. The choice you make now will shape the rest of your life. Richard swallowed hard. The weight of the decision was too much to bear. His father had lived with this burden. His mother had lived with it. And now, it was his turn. He thought of Mark. Of the future he wanted for his son. Could he really walk away from this, knowing that Mark might one day have to face the same dark legacy? "I need more time," Richard said, his voice breaking as he turned to leave. The man didn't stop him. "Take all the time you need," he said. "But remember, Richard, the clock is ticking. And time waits for no one." Richard walked out of the building, his mind in turmoil. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but one thing was certain: whatever choice he made would change everything. And there was no turning back now. Richard hadn't slept properly in days. Every time he closed his eyes, he was haunted by images of the Brotherhood, its shadowy members, their cryptic whispers, and the twisted sense of power they wielded from behind the curtain of history. His father's face loomed large in his mind, but it wasn't the familiar, distant figure Richard had grown up with. No, it was something darker, something Richard could barely recognize, a man not of his memories but of the past that had shaped him. Mark had tried to talk to him, tried to understand what Richard was going through, but Richard found it impossible to explain. How could he put into words the weight of everything he had discovered? How could he explain that the man who had raised him, who had been so distant, so unemotional, had been a part of something so dark and far-reaching? How could he even begin to explain to Mark the possibility that this very legacy, this burden of secrecy, was now his to carry? The nights were long, and the days felt even longer. Richard had locked himself away in his study, poring over the documents, the journals, and the cryptic messages his father had left behind. But the more he searched, the less he seemed to understand. Every answer led to more questions, and every page seemed to draw him deeper into the web of mystery that had consumed his family for generations. And then, there was the man. The one who had told Richard about the Brotherhood, the one who had revealed the truth about his father's involvement. Richard had returned to that building several times, but each time the man had given him only more vague hints, never any clear answers. He would talk in riddles, as though he knew Richard was standing on the precipice of something far greater, something that Richard wasn't yet ready to fully understand. "Time is running out, Richard," the man had said during their last meeting, his voice smooth and insistent. "You've seen the darkness now. You can't unsee it. You can't pretend it doesn't exist. You're not like the others. You're special. You've been chosen for this. But the choice is yours." That's what bothered Richard most. The choice. He was being given a chance to step into a world of power, of influence, a world where nothing was as it seemed, where people made decisions that shaped history from behind closed doors. He was being asked to take up his father's mantle, to lead the Brotherhood, or at least become an integral part of it. But what would it mean for him? What kind of man would he become? Could he live with the knowledge of the manipulation, the lies, the cold-blooded calculations that had defined his family's actions for centuries? Richard thought of Mark again. The weight of his son's future pressed on him more than ever. Mark was young, innocent, in many ways, and Richard had wanted to protect him from all of this. But now, it felt as though Mark would be forced to face this reality, whether Richard chose to confront it or not. How could Richard allow his son to live a life filled with such uncertainty, such danger? The choices Richard made would inevitably ripple through Mark's life as well, and Richard couldn't help but wonder what kind of future he was shaping for him. That night, as Richard sat alone in the study, he made a decision. It wasn't one that came lightly, nor one that he had arrived at quickly. He had spent days wrestling with the choice before him, but it was time to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The Brotherhood was not something he could ignore, and the legacy of his father wasn't something he could escape. He couldn't deny the call. The Brotherhood's power, its reach, was too vast. It was a force that had shaped his family, his father, and his own existence. And now, He was being asked to choose whether he would continue that legacy or destroy it entirely. But no matter what he chose, Richard knew that he couldn't walk away without facing the consequences of his actions. The Brotherhood didn't just let anyone go. Once you were in for life. Richard stood up from the desk, his decision made. He would go back to the man, the one who had shown him the truth. He would accept the offer. He would join the Brotherhood. But before he left the study, his eyes fell upon the photo on his desk. It was a picture of him and Mark, taken on a summer day years ago, before all of this madness had started. Mark was smiling, his face full of youthful innocence, unaware of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of their family. Richard's heart clenched in his chest as he looked at the photo. He had always wanted to protect Mark, to give him a better life than the one Richard had known. But now, it seemed that the very thing Richard had tried to shield him from would inevitably shape their future. With a sigh, Richard turned and walked out of the study, his mind resolute but his heart heavy. The choice had been made. Now, he had to face the consequences. The return to the Brotherhood. The man was waiting for him when Richard arrived. His calm demeanor, his cold, calculating eyes, they had not changed. Richard could feel the weight of his own decision bearing down on him as he walked into the building, stepping into a world he knew nothing about but was now bound to. The man didn't speak immediately, but his eyes gleamed with the same knowing look that had unsettled Richard the first time they met. "You've made your decision," the man said, his voice low and unwavering. "I knew you would. You're not like the others, Richard. You understand what's at stake. Most would have run by now, but you," he paused, as though searching for the right words. "You're different." Richard didn't respond. He wasn't sure how he felt. Relief? Fear? Regret? It was a jumble of emotions that he couldn't quite untangle. He had made his choice, but now that he was standing here, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something far deeper than he could have ever imagined. "Come," the man said, turning toward the hallway. "There's much to discuss, and time is not on our side." Richard followed him down the narrow corridor, the walls lined with old, faded portraits of people whose names he didn't recognize. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of secrecy, a weight that seemed to hang in the air like a fog. Richard's heart beat faster with every step, every turn, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had made this choice. There was no turning back now. They reached a door at the end of the hallway, and the man knocked twice before entering. Inside, a group of people sat around a long table, their faces obscured by shadows. Richard's stomach tightened as he recognized the figures seated at the table, their presence unsettling in its anonymity. "Richard," the man said, gesturing for him to sit. "Meet the council." The room fell silent as Richard took a seat. The council members did not speak, but their eyes studied him intently, as though weighing his every move, every breath. They were the ones who held the true power, the ones who controlled the Brotherhood. Richard was not yet a part of them, but he was about to be. The man who had led Richard into the room took a seat at the head of the table. "You've made the right choice, Richard," he said, his tone both approving and calculating. "The Brotherhood needs you. You have a legacy to uphold, and we believe you are the one to lead us into the next phase." Richard felt a chill crawl up his spine. Lead them into the next phase? What did that even mean? What kind of future was he being asked to shape? One of the council members, a woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, leaned forward. "We've been waiting for someone like you, Richard. Your father was strong, but he lacked vision. He was a man of action, but he never fully embraced the true potential of the Brotherhood. That's where you come in. You have the power to shape things, to influence the course of history." Richard's mind was spinning. He wanted to ask questions, to demand answers. What did they want from him? What would be expected of him? But the answers weren't coming. Instead, he was being thrust into a world where nothing was clear, where the future seemed as murky as the past. "What do you need me to do?" Richard asked, his voice strained. The man at the head of the table smiled, his expression cold and calculating. "Everything, Richard. We need you to help us guide the future. The choices you make now will affect generations to come. You are no longer just a man. You are a symbol, a leader. The future of the Brotherhood is in your hands." Richard's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of those words settled on him. He wasn't just a member of this group. He was being groomed to lead them. To become the very thing his father had been, a puppet master behind the scenes, controlling the fate of nations. And as the council members watched him with their piercing eyes, Richard knew that this was just the beginning. The future was uncertain, and there was no telling what path he would walk. But one thing was certain, there was no going back.